Hold on.
Skip and check it.
Hi, it's Sunday afternoon, the 8th of March. I'm sitting here in our living room with Ron Wild. It's 4:20 in the afternoon, and we're here to chat about Ron's work, Ron's connection with Burke Brown, my uncle, and then the piece of art that you can see on the wall behind me that is the work of this wonderful young fellow here. So we decided we would like to try to capture some thoughts, some historical references, discussions with Burke Brown, and the inspiration behind what Ron called the chance map.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So welcome, Ron.
Thanks, Dave. This is great that we're
have you
doing
here.
this.
I guess one of the first things I'd like to ask you is, how did you meet Burke Brown? And then how did you develop the content for this wonderful graphic here?
Sure. So my wife and I moved from Edmonton to Toronto in 2008. And probably a year or two after that, I was at a conference that was put on by a group called Subtle Technologies, which Jim Ruxton founded. And I don't remember the theme of it was a 1 day or 2 day maybe conference, but I do remember that's where I met Burke.
At the Subtle Technologies.
Yeah, Subtle Technologies conference. At a break or at the end of the first day, I just got chatting with him a little bit and was intrigued with I asked him what he was working on, and so the next step was through email. Burke invited me to a lunch meeting at the Donelda Golf Club, and I remember that very clearly. That went to have a lunch meeting, and I just took so many notes because there was just so much about what he was saying that was of interest and just intriguing to me, that we met several times over months and probably stretched into years, where I was trying to learn more about some of the concepts, because the more time I spent with Burke, the more interested I was in him and his ideas in particular. Then, I guess a couple of years later, Burke moved, and his health didn't quite allow him to be as mobile. So I would go to to his new residence facility, and again over lunch there we continue our discussions.
You were making notes, I guess, right?
all the time, yeah, making notes.
Well, you're a naturally very inquisitive fellow.
Well, I am,
what?
but Burke is a fascinating, multi-layered person, so I don't see how anyone could not be fascinated with Burke and his ideas.
Where were you in your career during your discussions with Burke? You were doing other things, I presume.
I was, and one of the other connections was when I first moved to Toronto. Basically, I was still sort of the tail end of my entrepreneurial career. Out in Edmonton, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, had a small computer training business. It was a hands-on instructor-led format, which had kind of run its course. I was sort of transitioning into, did I want to do a startup in e-learning? So, and then we moved to Toronto to help my wife's career, and by then I'd just kind of back down to just like a research mode, and I was working on a visual interface to information, like a mapping interface. So I was working on that, but what I was excited about to moving to Toronto about was there's two or three facilities and things that were available in Toronto that weren't available to me in Edmonton. One was it was pretty close, or closer than Edmonton, to the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, which was an organization that's always fascinated me. Second one was the Mars Research Center, that I was happy to be a few subway stops away from and could learn more about. And the third was the Fields Institute for mathematical research. So when we moved to Toronto 2008, so it was just me basically working at home on my own, doing this research. but also wanting to delve into these organizations. The closest one was was Mars, and I did something called the Mars map of, and basically what it is, it's I call them maps, is when there's a new field that I'm interested in, my way of exploring it and making notes is visually.
I see.
And these end up being just collages of graphics, of representations of ideas, of visual metaphors, maybe short quotations.
So did you produce a work of art for
I
Mars?
did. So yeah, well, it's called the Mars map.
Where is it now?
Unfortunately, it's in my basement. My goal is that it be, I shouldn't say that. I did show it as a piece of art, and literally a Bay Street lawyer did buy it as a piece of art. So actually it's probably in either on his wall or in his basement. The second one I did was the fields map. So and it's actually in, a sample of it is actually in this piece, I've noticed. And that was my way of learning about what the Fields Institute was about. And so about the time I met Burke, I was either working on the Mars map and or the Fields map,
I see.
doing this research, and just being fascinated by him.
How many pieces like this have you made?
Yes, so these on my own, even when I was in Edmonton is when I started doing this as my way of keeping a visual note-keeping system for myself as I was doing this e-learning mapping interface. I think probably over 100
Really?
maps. Now in collaboration, and the collaborative efforts are my favorite ones. So I've done collaborations where we've produced a work of art, a map, with medical researchers, mathematicians, scientists, physicists, and I include Burke in that category. In collaborations, I've probably collaborated with a dozen different people from all over the world in any of those disciplines.
Is there a particular package or a software methodology that you use to produce these?
Very basic. I just use Photoshop and use
Photoshop for the individual images.
Yes, and each layer is a separate graphic element.
Yes.
So it's just a matter of layering them, transparency, changing size, and it's just a collage is my style.
Right.
So that's really all I need.
And is there a package that you use that produces a final print? Is it all Photoshop?
Yep, really is. Yep, very, very simple. And I'm quite careful on each layer that I name it to be my version or representation of what I'm trying to represent. It's not necessarily the mathematical or the medical or the physicist
But the
term,
image has some significance in your mind.
Oh yeah. So when sitting down with an expert like Burke is, I'm making notes trying to understand fields like tensegrity or topology or histopathology or some of these very deep specialties, which I know nothing about. The collaborators are generally quite patient and try to explain it, and then I, in my mind, try to capture either by the words they've used or the terms, and sometimes depending on the relationship and how much time the collaborator has, we'll sit down side by side with the laptop and choose a graphical metaphor for an idea he's explaining, or I'll just go back with my notes and with Google image search try to find something that triggers or at least encapsulates part of the idea, and then I take that as an image, work sometimes quite extensively just with that one piece of it, but that just really represents one layer. Until there's 80 to 100 layers, my work isn't really done. So generally there's 80 to 100. Now a graphic element may be a very blurry background over a large area, or maybe a very small icon, but there's 80 to 100 layers in each.
So these images end up being a work of art.
Yeah,
But
so
you didn't start out as an artist.
no, I started making these or collaging ideas together as a personal visual note-keeping system.
I see.
Is that I could look at it and I could see, oh yeah, I'm working with this idea from the graph cartography or this from mapping, and I think this e-learning thing, and this is what reminds me of it or represents it. And every 2 weeks I would just sort of collage them together just as to see where I've been, the ideas, how they developed, and which ones I want to take further. So no, it was very accidental. When I first moved to Toronto, a few people sort of looking over my shoulder saw what I was doing, and they asked me if I was an artist, and my response was no. I'm a what was I calling myself? A graphical interface researcher and developer. You know, when I was working on my thing, and they would say, "Well, they're cool. You should show those." And so 2 or 3 people said this, and I thought, well, I'm not an artist. I don't know if this is art. It's just my personal, and I knew, you know, by then it was collaging that I was doing, and so I said, you know, I'll let the experts decide. So at the time in the Globe and Mail, there was a newspaper, there was an ad for something called the Artist Project, and I thought, oh, that caught my eye because I'm wondering, you know, is this art? Is this not art? You know, I'll let them decide. So I applied to this show, made an application to be a participating presenter or a participant and to show what I was doing, and got accepted, and didn't really think much of it because it was expensive, and I thought, oh, they probably have a hard time getting enough artists that want to even do this. So I went, you know, very naively, you know, banged some nails, hung my things up, and then only then kind of learned that this was quite a prestigious art art show.
Yes.
And then people were coming in and by their questions and comments. I don't know if the first show if I sold anything, but the comments were very supportive, and the people who ran the show, they gave me a prime location on the main thoroughfare. So I was thinking, these people think this is art, so I kind of just went with it.
Unexpected for you.
Yeah, it just evolved. It wasn't my intention, but it came to me.
In our conversations, you've indicated to me that you're pushing yourself in some respects. You're an engineer by training.
Yep.
Yet you have evolved yourself or pushed yourself into the field of art.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about,
so
that?
as you said, my first degree was engineering, very traditional civil structural engineering, you know, ground up, rational, linear approach. But even then, I was, and even in third year engineering, I was thinking, I'll probably want to do a master's, and I wasn't sure if I'd go the super MSc technology route or the management of business and technology. Worked a couple of years, that's all it took at the time to get my PhD. Did an MBA, then really got into information and information technology, and then had this idea of the computer training and then the e-learning, the visual note-keeping system, and this got me all the way over to art. But at my core or in my blood is still engineering, so there's a whole community of art science people, sort of the overlap or the combination of art and science. And sort of a side note, another reason I was interested in that is while I was in engineering, I actually had a very bad skull fracture, and I started learning about left brain and right brain and those kinds of things. So I've been an amateur researcher on that. Left brain, right brain, creativity, you know, and rational engineering and art. So now I actually call myself a digital art science collaborator. That I heard about this on the internet, came across this conference called Mapping Knowledge Domains. And I said, just from the title, I said, I don't know where this conference is, but this sounds like what I'm into and I better go to it. And so ever since I've been an advocate for that scientists and artists, there's things that at the intersection or at the union that can happen that can't happen in
You
either
also told me that you force yourself to journal with your left hand.
Yeah,
You're not left-handed, you're right-handed.
Yeah, I am, and that's part of the left brain, right brain thing.
Yes.
There's actually a famous book called, well, 2 books that this is based on. One is called The Artist's Way, and one of the things, Betty Block is the author, she talks about journaling, and it's a good thing to do. You just sit down, and it's a sort of stream of conscious journaling of, and fill 2 pages. So whatever, you have to fill 2 pages. And then about the same time I came across a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And in there, one of the exercises or challenges was to do something with your non-dominant hand. So I am right-handed, as you said, so that would mean I would have to draw left-handed, paint left-handed, and I thought, well, I'm journaling, why don't I combine these 2 and try writing left-handed?
How are you at it?
I've been doing it probably 20 plus years, every weekday morning. I write 2 pages left-handed. Now it's like almost legible.
Really?
But at the first it was like picking up a pen, and it was like, how does this work? And then it was really an interesting. But
have you changed as a result? You think that using your left hand for journaling has changed you in some way?
Yeah. I think some of the research with the hippocampus and across, it's when I'm doing things left-handed. Actually, I've taken it further. This experiment, I bought a set of left-handed golf clubs.
Oh,
to take it to that level. I still to this day I mouse with the left hand. On all
but
whatever
you're forcing yourself to.
Yeah, I continue it because I do find, and artists do when they're painting or in their kind of in the zone. And there's that famous book called Flow. When you're in that zone, the right brain, the rational, the sort of the self-talk, the verbal, sort of stops, and you're creating, you're drawing or whatever, and it's a whole different way of thinking and a way of being that I'm very interested in and want to be part of my life. So I do a lot of things left-handed to this day for that reason. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm gonna stop it now.
Sure.
And see if
See if we've got it. Yeah. Sure.
See if it worked. Ron, I'm going to ask you some questions now about this wonderful piece, which I know you call a chance map. It has quite a few images in it. I'm going to ask you how many and where the inspiration or the idea to use a particular image came from. So I'll zoom in here, you pick something and give us a best explanation you can.
Sure.
I notice, if I may, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about this guy. This is one of my favorite characters.
Okay.
This is Mr. Magoo.
It is.
And it's a puppet version of Mr. Magoo.
Yes.
And of course, in his later years, Burke Brown started to look a little bit like Mr. Magoo.
Yep. That's part of it. There's actually more to it than that. This was a cartoon, and it wasn't necessarily my favorite, but when I was growing up, there was always this one scene or this thing that obviously stuck with me. When it was Mr. Magoo, he was on his construction site, and he couldn't hardly see, but as he would walk around, a beam would magically, come in front of him just as he was about to plunge to his death, and you walk across it.
Yeah.
So the whole, as I was talking to Burke, one of the connections I was making was the idea of chance and of synchronicity and things coming together. So, and as you could say, also over in the corner, and Burke used sort of a Hitchcock element as one of his visual icons. But with Mr. Magoo, I added in the puppetry based on some discussions with Burke when he was talking about free will, and are we really making decisions, or is there, is it all preordained, or is it chance? And
free will and determinism, which appear to conflict, they do in fact coexist.
Yeah.
And that was part of his thesis about economic man, was the predictability and the randomness combined.
Yeah, so that little thing put together with the puppet controls was to capture some of that idea.
Right.
Other these things would come where I would meet with Burke, then I would go back and with Google image search put the keyword in or the phrase,
Yes.
then find an image, then decide if it works. Others are a reference to just Fields Institute in general.
So what else stands out in your mind here from a historical point of view in your conversations with Burke? What image would you pick next?
One of the things, I mean, these here, this area is the Galton board, the normal distribution, the app that they put me onto that they can run that.
Yes.
And it sort of was from this over here is sort of some of my thinking of, yeah, it's a smooth curve, but I'm also always been interested in fractals. So, you know, the red line is just a simple, maybe like a triangulated normal distribution curve, but then the green one is next level of fractaling, and this one even further. So I was, because with the idea of chance and probability and the normal distribution curve is that I'm thinking that there's influences or there's other things happening at the same time, sort of within it.
Yes.
And so I wanted to sort of capture that, and this little bit of area is, I think, one of the interesting things that I came to. And then, I mean, every element that I look at either reminds me of what I thought about then, or that now. This is, I believe, was finished in 2015. So this is 4 or 5 years since it's been completed, and I've learned lots. So now when I see things, I may see them differently than I did even in the very, very first place.
So if you were doing it again today, you might add.
Oh, yeah, it could be quite different.
Let me ask you about what appears to be the three-dimensional view here of the normal distribution. You see the item that I'm right there.
Right here.
What is that? Do you recall?
Yeah, no, I can't tell you which keyword I put into the Google image search. Maybe it was normal distribution, and a 3D version came up, and I thought, sort of back to some of the fractal kinds of ideas that, you know, on different elements, depending on how you come at it and inflection points. So a lot of times it's not a super detailed, rational explanation. Yes. It's something that caught my attention, and I wanted to capture, and so I collaged it in.
And what about the multicolored piece here, just to the left and below? Yes. What have you got there?
Yeah, this is actually a portion of the Fields map.
Oh, I
so
see.
This is hanging in the Fields Institute.
This is the collage that you did for Fields.
Yeah, so this is called the Fields map, and this is a sample of it. And because both Burke and I have a connection to the Fields Institute, there's a few references to Fields. This is one.
It's quite amazing how much detail you're able to put here. That's a large piece by itself.
Yeah, 6 feet by 4 feet.
But it is also, it's quite visible. You can see here in detail what's there.
Yep, and I also have these, all of my maps in a, it's called GigaPan. It's a service which basically provides a Google Map interface.
Oh, yes.
So you can zoom in. So there'll be a GigaPan of this chance map, and you could zoom into any of these elements. So it's kind of like a further zooming in capability that's provided. So each of these maps, like the Fields map itself and the chance map here, have between 80 and 100 elements. So like this would be an element.
Yes.
This would be an element. These big black lines would be an element. The Epiphany symbol would be. Anyways, so there's 80 to 100 of those that are layered together, collaged together.
Where does that number come from? Is that an upper limit on how many that you can manage easily? Or
well, I guess it's just evolved. When I started doing these, I would just keep going. And one of the artist's most difficult questions is, when is a work of art done?
Yes.
And it seemed to me, as I was doing dozens and dozens of these on different topics, that around that range seemed to be enough to be rich,
Yes.
but not too much.
not
Now,
too much.
some people will say this is way too much, but in my mind, it needs this much to be interesting.
Let me
and
ask
to,
you about
sure.
this piece here.
This one?
Yes.
So this is another one of my maps. It's probably one that I was working on at the time that I was
I see.
meeting with Burke. So I just put it in as almost a timestamp or a cross-reference.
So would we be able to look at this in more detail in GigaPen? Is this item,
Yeah.
is it there? Is it stored there? Or
Yes.
is GigaPen something that you use on your own website?
No, it's available to the public. I'm trying to get closer. Now this one probably has a GigaPen of its own. I know the
Yes.
Fields map has a GigaPen of its own.
I see. And where would it be? Where would we find it?
It's gigapan.com. Put in chance map,
Oh, okay.
and you'll come up with chance map and be
Got it.
able to zoom into this. You would go further if you were able to bridge
I
over
see.
to the,
Yes.
but you'll get to zoom in. Sorry for doing that.
That's okay.
Really closely on that.
I find that the whole piece is just spectacular. I could stand here, I think, listening to you for hours. I
Yeah.
could look at it even without you talking,
Yeah.
because it's captured my imagination. Now you have it looks like you've got a quotation here.
Yes, in most of the maps there'll be some text, some quotation, and part of that
What
is
is that? What is this?
this one in particular is just Ecclesiastes.
Oh, I see.
And it's sort of the the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
So Burke is often quoting this. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift nor the battle to the strong. Yes.
Yeah, and it was because like you
That's-
said, Burke.
Maybe that's the motto for the chants.
Yeah, it came out of my discussions with Burke.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me as important, so I worked it in as one of the elements in the chance
Is
map.
there any particular element here that you found challenging in order to wrap your head around it?
Yes, and maybe even with this line here.
This looks like an eel.
Yeah, it
But
does
it's not.
No, it's lined up on one of the lines that go to Epiphany,
I see.
and it's just basically a fuzzy and curved
Mm-hmm.
line. So the concept being of something is definite. In one of my takeaways from meeting with Burke and learning from him is that rarely in nature or anywhere is something absolute. There's always
Yes.
there's always a distribution around it. So that this line is thicker
Right.
than the line. It's fuzzier. It's not exactly
fit.
straight, and you'll see it.
Doesn't fit on purpose, I guess. Eh?
Yeah, oh yeah, no, and I laid it out on there as and I also see now even just data. When you see data, it's up and down. And there's, but people will draw a line through there and say, this is what it is.
Uh-huh.
But in reality, no, it's not,
not
this.
that.
It's not that. It's
Right.
it looks like that.
That's the
And-
background noise in the universe.
yeah,
Or
yeah. There's
something like that.
yeah.
What
And
about the brain? The thing that here looks like the brain. Is that a piece that you did at Baycrest? Is that the one that you were
No,
talking
but
about?
what's interesting, and this has happened several times, is I will do a map and I'll put things in it, which will later manifest in reality.
Oh,
So
really?
here's an example of
No,
one I
that's
liked.
interesting. So you didn't know anything about the competition?
No,
at
Baycrest I don't think existed.
No.
I don't think at
Not
the time I was
that
doing
project didn't.
Yeah, that project didn't. But here,
Ah.
why this is in here is like I call these maps, and there's basically a mind mapping element to
Yes.
what I do in my approach. So when I saw this, I thought it captures the idea of the concept of mind mapping
Right.
in the brain, and as you're referencing, a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to do a 3D brain where I
A large one.
yeah, it's way more than full size, and so it is funny that has happened more than once, and so there's times
The story of your life.
yeah, it's a kind of a visualization that some of the things I put into a map. Maybe it's because now I'm looking for it or subconsciously,
Yeah.
but that's it's always delightful when that happens.
Okay, tell me about what looks like a fish being speared. Am I right?
Yeah, it is, and he's got
He's got
a shark.
I just saw one of those yesterday in a commercial.
Yeah.
This is a fish behaving or acting or appearing to look like a shark out of self-protection. Right?
And
Neat.
there's always some humor, or mostly a lot of jokes that are just only that I will ever get. But it could have been as simple as something like that I came across it, and I thought I liked the spirit of it, and that you can't say that it is a fish or it is a shark. It's kind of both or either.
It's a fish that wants to be
yeah, exactly.
wants to be a shark.
So yeah, to your point is maybe it's just over time something will happen to make a change from one form to the other.
Well, Ron, I find the whole piece just beautiful, aesthetically, intellectually challenging, and I do appreciate the opportunity to ask you about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me talk about it.